it's Mermaid Minnow. If you saw last week's video, then you would know that this week we're going to be talking about minor repairs to fabric tails. If you didn't get a chance to see last week's video and you would like to see it, then I'll go ahead and throw a card up above. But please know, there is no need to see that video. It is related, but it's not sequential. So it gives a little context as to why this video came about, but it's not pertinent to this video itself. So, first thing is that I am not a professional seamstress. So I did make some mistakes in this video, so please learn from my mistakes so that way you don't make the same mistakes as I did. The other thing is this is not a basic tutorial, so it's going to be about hand sewing repairs. So if you have not done hand sewing before, I'll go ahead and throw a video in the description below that goes over the basics like threading a needle, tying knots, and basic stitches. So that might be really helpful for you. The other option too, if you have not done any hand sewing before, is that you can go ahead and go to your local craft store and take a class too. But again, if you just want a quick little video, that's in the description for you. So this video, we're going to look at two different types of repairs. So I have my H2O tail from Made by a Mermaid Haley that was last week's video, and then I do have my Clever Girl tail from Shop Vancouver Mermaid, and that's the one we're actually going to start with. A little bit of context for this tail. So the technique that I use in repairing these two mermaid tails actually came from suggestions from Courtney Mermaid. So I reached out to her when I first noticed Clever Girl had an issue back in April, and she was incredibly responsive. She responded, I think, within 24 hours and offered to do a Zoom call with me to show me how to repair the mermaid tail. So I really appreciate that. Courtney, if you're watching, thank you so much. But the thing is, I did not actually repair the mermaid tail until July. So why that was a problem is two reasons. Number one, the Zoom video that Courtney went over everything with me on was no longer available. So I could have reached out to Courtney and asked for it and could have gotten a different copy of it, but because I wanted to swim in my H2O tail this next week, I did not do that. So forewarning, some of the stuff that I remember may be different from what she actually taught me, but the basics are there. The second thing as well is that I swam in the tail once between the actual issue happening and the repair. So it did change how I had to repair the tail, and I'll explain that a little bit more now too. So starting off with what was wrong with the tail. So on the left hip fin, there was some stitching on the fin that came loose. So the thread was up a little bit. So you can see that here. Now, that wasn't anything that would impact the structure of the tail or anything like that. If anything, it would create a little bit of ballooning in the tail if it had pulled up more, but in the state it currently was, it was not impacting the tail in the slightest. I don't know how the loose thread came to be. I talked to Courtney about it. We kind of were racking our brains. It's possible that maybe when my mer tender was transporting my tails, he got it caught on something and he doesn't remember it, but those things do happen. So we're not really sure what happened, but you can see it's not a clean break. It literally just kind of lifted up on the thread there. So what I ended up doing for Clever Girl is something that, you know, I probably could have done differently. I did a running stitch, but instead of having it just go up and down, I ended up doing it close together. So I would go up and then back through the same hole I just went down, up, and then down to make it look close. I did that on both the front and the back side. I did also start a few stitches back so that way it could be a little bit more reinforced where it had come loose. So I was kind of going over where it had come a little bit before it had come loose and then the spot it had come loose. Again, if you use a different stitch, you may not have to do it the same way, but that's what I had to do for my tail. After I tied it off, this is the thing that I remember most from her Zoom video. I took a little bit of E6000 that she suggested, put it on a toothpick, rubbed some of that off so I didn't have too much on the toothpick, and then used that to strengthen the ends of the thread by gluing them down. So I did that on both the bottom and the top. So as you can see here, the top, again, the thread isn't matched color-wise, but it doesn't look too bad. This is a wet tail, let me go ahead and preface. I have swam in it since I did stitch, and it has held up beautifully. So this does look a little bit different than it would dry, but you can see that there's, you know, it looks pretty much like a normal stitch. I did a pretty good job on the top. The back, on the other hand, there was one part where for whatever reason I left the thread long, and so when I went ahead and glued it down, it came back out as like this really thick glue patch and just this line of thread. So something you should note is make sure when you're clipping your thread, you're clipping it closer to the knot than I did, so that way it's not so much noticeable. Now, on the mermaid tail, it is the back side of the fin, so it's really not all that big of a deal, and it's so small it's not noticeable. This was an option I didn't mention this, but this was the option that I chose to do. Courtney had offered to split shipping to get it sent back to her to fix it herself, but I wanted to try and do it myself, and honestly, I kind of like it. Even with the mismatch of thread and the weird glue part in the bottom and the back, I think it just makes it a little bit more unique. So that's how that tail turned out. So I used the things that Courtney had taught me and I applied them to my H2O mermaid tail. If you saw last week's video, you would see specifically when I did film in this video, the holes that were just below the waistband on the side seams. So that looks like right there she didn't stitch it up. Her suggestion was just to use E6000 to close it up, which I did do for the fluke part, but I wanted to stitch it to give it a little bit more reinforcement. Now, the stitching used on this mermaid tail is a zigzag stitch, and that's something that I've heard is really good for mermaid tails. Again, not a seamstress, so I can't tell you, but so I tried to recreate that. There might be a tutorial out there of how to hand stitch a zigzag stitch, but I just guessed. So using a very similar method, I went ahead, went up into one hole, went down into the other, and then came up and then went down. So it's almost ended up being like triangles rather than zigzags. So I went ahead and did that the length of the hole, and then same thing, I went ahead and used some E6000 to glue down the ends of the thread to give it a little bit more strength. Again, I did it on both sides for this one as well, so the stitching I did again try to match as best as I can, but the zigzag stitch looks a lot uglier in my opinion than the Clever Girl straight stitch that I did. But you know what? It doesn't matter because this is inside the tail, so you won't actually see this. If you can see from this picture here of the after, you can see this is my mertender trying to push his finger through the hole, and there's no hole there. So it just looks like it was sewn up. So inside, not so pretty, outside was fine. But like I said, I did reinforce that with E6000, and then again, I used just E6000 on the very small hole down by the fluke, since that was sort of glued already. That also has been swam in, and unfortunately, my concerns about the length made it so that I couldn't swim in the tail for very long, but I was hiking up the tail quite a bit, and the stitch has stayed. So both of those situations, it did work. So again, this might not be the best video to show you how to fix things, so I apologize if you're watching this and feeling like there might be a little bit of false advertising in there, but the thing to know is that when you are repairing a fabric tail, having some basic knowledge of sewing, even if it's not that great as in my case, and using some E6000 to seal it all off will do wonders for you and will help you be able to use your tail longer by repairing any small little things that happen before they become big things. So we all know how expensive mermaid tails are, so we all know how important of a skill that is to have. If you do have anything that happens to a tail, I would always recommend reaching out to the tail maker themselves as well. Like I said, these were tips that I had received from Courtney and they worked well for both of my tails, but depending on the different types of stitching and whatnot, they may recommend some other things. Remember, your tail maker knows your tails best. So just like any other video I've mentioned, if there's anything you notice, make sure to reach out to your tail maker for suggestions and see what they're able to do to help you as well. Because a lot of times they're willing to assist you in ways of financial compensation or helping you send it back or something like that. So keep that in mind if you do find some minor repairs that need to be done after a swim or two or anything like that. So that's all I have for this video. If you liked it, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up and comment down below. Have you had to repair a fabric mermaid tail before? If so, what did you do? Maybe we can share some tips and tricks with each other so that way when I repair my next mermaid tail, it looks a little prettier than it did this time. If you're not already, please go ahead and subscribe to this channel, and if you would like to, there are my other social medias in the description down below that you can follow me and see different types of content too. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll swim with you all in the next video. Bye!